A poor homeless girl was scavenging through alleys for food when she heard desperate screams. She peeked around the corner and froze. The son of a millionaire was being dragged by two men into a black van. With survival instincts kicking in, she snatched a wooden stick from the trash and followed the kidnappers down the dark alley. She shouted with all her strength, "Let him go now!" The men turned, cold eyes locked on her like predators. Just as she realized she had made the biggest mistake of her life, something happened that left everyone in shock. The afternoon sun poured liquid gold over the glass skyscrapers that pierced the blue sky, turning the city into a glistening jewel. For little Leah, just 7 years old, the city was a two-faced monster, one that displayed shop windows full of colorful sweets and clothes that looked fit for a princess, and another, the one she knew, made of cold shadows, hard pavement, and the constant echo of hunger in her stomach. Her bare feet, calloused and dirty, barely felt the heat radiating from the concrete as she moved with the stealth of a stray kitten, her large, watchful eyes scanning every corner for an opportunity. Leah couldn't remember a time when she wasn't alone. Her memory was a blur of hands that had let go and faces that had turned away, leaving behind only an emptiness she filled with a fierce determination to simply exist. Her home was whatever shelter the night offered, and her family, the fleeting warmth of a sunbeam on a cold day. That day, the aroma of fresh bread wafting from an artisan bakery was torturing her. She stopped for a moment, closing her eyes and inhaling deeply, imagining the soft, warm taste melting in her mouth. A sigh escaped her thin lips. Imagination was a feast that couldn't fill her belly. When she opened her eyes again, her trained gaze swept the street. Well-dressed people hurried past, lost in their own worlds. Their cell phones glued to their ears, their worries as distant from hers as the clouds in the sky. It was then that a sound cut through the urban symphony, a sharp, desperate sound that made every hair on her arms stand on end. It was a child's scream, not a scream of tantrum or play, but a scream of pure terror. Leah's intuition, her faithful survival companion, guided her instantly. The sound was coming from a narrow alley, a dark slice between two towering buildings. Without a second of hesitation, she ran in that direction, her small heart hammering against her ribs. The scene she found paralyzed her for a millisecond. A blonde boy, a little younger than her, dressed in a pristine white polo shirt and shoes that shone even in the gloom, was being dragged by two tall men toward a dark van parked at the end of the alley. The boy struggled, his little legs kicking the air, his face red and wet with tears. "Help! Daddy!" he cried, his voice choked with sobs. A fire she didn't know she possessed ignited inside Leah. That boy was like a helpless sparrow in the talons of two hawks. The whole world might have looked the other way, but she couldn't. In a corner of the alley, she saw a piece of a broken wooden crate with a bent nail sticking out of the end. It was a piece of trash to anyone else, but for her, in that moment, it was a weapon. She gripped it with both hands, the rough wood scratching her palms. She filled her small lungs with all the air she could and ran toward the men, raising the piece of wood like a sword. "Leave him alone!" she yelled with a force that surprised even herself. Her voice echoed off the brick walls, amplified by rage and a sense of justice. The sudden noise made the men turn, startled. Her shout, along with the boys, finally pierced the street's bubble of indifference. Hurried footsteps began to approach, curious voices asking what was happening. The men glanced at each other, panic stamped on their faces. They let the boy go and scrambled into the van, which took off with a squeal of tires, disappearing onto the busy street. In seconds, a small crowd had formed. Someone recognized the little boy. "It's Mr. Sterling's son," a woman exclaimed. The boy, still trembling, ran into the arms of a security guard who appeared. In the confusion, Leah retreated into the shadows, her heart still racing. She had done the right thing, But as she watched the boy being comforted, her sharp eyes caught a movement across the street. Hidden behind a luxury car, a woman was watching the scene. It was the boy's nanny. Leah recognized her at a glance, but there was no relief or panic on her face. There was only a calculated coldness, a frightening stillness that didn't match the chaos of the moment. Her eyes met Leah's for a fraction of a second, and a shiver ran down the girl's spine. The woman didn't look worried. She looked disappointed. The siren of a police cruiser grew closer, and the buzz of the crowd intensified, turning the alley into a stage. But the star of the show was no longer Leah. As soon as the danger had passed, she became invisible again, a shadow melting into other shadows. The relief she felt at seeing the boy safe was quickly swallowed by the old feeling of not belonging anywhere. She backed away, one step at a time, until the cold wall of a building touched her back. From there, she watched the scene unfold as if it were a movie. The woman she'd seen hiding, the nanny, suddenly rushed to the center of the commotion. Her face contorted into a convincing mask of panic. "Leo! Oh my God, Leo!" she cried, her voice thick with fake tears. She knelt and hugged the boy, who flinched in her arms. I just turned away for a second. Just 1 second to get a tissue from my bag, and they appeared out of nowhere. It all happened so fast. Her words were a torrent of excuses and distress, and the crowd seemed to sympathize with her, offering words of comfort. But Leah saw the truth. She saw the lie in the woman's eyes, the same coldness she had seen seconds before, now hidden under a layer of hysteria. Her stomach churned. A gleaming black sedan screeched to a halt, and a tall man in a perfectly tailored grey suit leaped out before the driver could even open the door. It was Mr. Sterling, the boy's father. His face, usually calm and imposing in newspaper photos, was pale and tense. He pushed through the crowd, which parted for him like the sea, and wrapped his son in a desperate hug, lifting him off the ground. My son, are you okay?" he murmured, his voice hoarse with emotion, kissing the top of the boy's blonde head. For a moment, the powerful businessman was just a terrified father. Leo, finally feeling safe, clung to his father's neck and began to cry for real, a cry of relief and exhaustion. Through his sobs, he tried to speak. "The girl, Daddy, a girl," but his voice was a whisper lost in the noise. Mr. Sterling, focused on calming his son, didn't understand his words. Leah felt it was time to go. The police were asking questions, and she knew people like her weren't welcome in situations like this. She turned and slipped away, disappearing into the city's labyrinthine streets, taking with her the disturbing image of the nanny's gaze. That night, in her makeshift shelter behind a restaurant, she couldn't sleep. The warmth of the bread donated by the cook didn't warm the chill she felt inside. That boy, Leo, with his scared blue eyes, had awakened a protective instinct in her she didn't know she had. And the nanny, why would she lie? Why would she watch from afar as the child she was supposed to protect was in danger? Meanwhile, in the vast, silent Sterling mansion, Leo sat on his bed, surrounded by more toys than a child could ever want. But he didn't touch any of them. He refused dinner, a plate of his favorite food. His father, Richard Sterling, sat beside him, exhaustion marking his face. "You're safe now, champ. No one's going to hurt you," he said softly. Leo shook his head, his large, serious eyes fixed on his father. "You didn't save me, Daddy. It was a girl." Richard frowned. "The security guard got there quickly, son. And the police." "No," Leo insisted, his voice gaining strength. "There was a girl. She was little like me, but she was so brave. She yelled at the bad men. She had a piece of wood." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. He thought it was the imagination of a traumatized child, a way of coping with the fear. "All right, son, get some rest now." But Leo didn't move. He looked at his father with a determination that mirrored Leah's. The nanny wasn't there. She was gone. The girl helped me. We have to find her, Daddy. We have to thank her. You have to find her." The next morning dawned under a tense silence in the Sterling mansion. Richard had barely slept, the image of his son's terrified face replaying in his mind. He tried to focus on the financial reports spread across his solid mahogany desk, but the numbers danced meaninglessly before his eyes. Leo's insistence on a brave girl seemed like a childish fairy tale, a fantasy created to make sense of a traumatic event. Kids did that, he thought. They created imaginary heroes to fight real fears. Yet, the conviction in his son's voice disturbed him. It was a note of truth in the midst of chaos. When Leo walked into the office, already dressed for school but with his arms crossed and a stubborn expression, Richard knew he could no longer ignore the issue. "Dad, I'm not going to school, and I'm not eating. Not until we find the girl." His voice was quiet but firm. Richard sighed, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He looked at his son, seeing not a tantrum, but a deep, unshakable conviction. The boy was asking for help in the only way he knew how. Defeated, Richard picked up the phone. "Marcus," he said to his head of security, "I want you to find a girl, 7 years old, dark hair, barefoot. She was in the alley yesterday. Check every security camera in the area. I want her found. Now." For Leah, the morning was a repeat of the usual routine. The sun began to warm the sidewalks, and she searched for a trash can that might offer breakfast. Her thoughts, however, weren't on hunger, but on the blue-eyed boy. She wondered if he was okay, if he was safe in his giant house. The worry was a new and strange feeling, a small warmth in her chest that made her feel less alone. It was then that a man in a suit approached her. Leah flinched instinctively, ready to run. People like him usually shooed her away, but the man knelt to get on her eye level. "Are you the girl who was in the alley yesterday?" he asked in a surprisingly gentle voice. Leah just nodded, her heart pounding. "Mr. Sterling would like to speak with you. He wants to thank you." Fear gave way to confusion. Thank her? Minutes later, she was sitting on the soft leather seat of a car that smelled new, watching the city pass by through tinted windows. The car drove through imposing iron gates and stopped in front of a house that looked more like a palace. Leah entered the mansion with hesitant feet. The marble floor was so polished it reflected her dirty face like a still pool of water. The air was cool and scented with flowers she had never seen before. Everything was vast, silent, and clean. She felt like a smudge of soot on a pristine painting. Richard Sterling was waiting for her in a large room with floor-to-ceiling windows. He was even taller and more intimidating up close. He offered her a glass of juice and a plate of cookies, which she accepted with trembling hands. "My son told me you helped him," Richard began, his voice formal. "I'm very grateful. I want to give you a reward." He gestured to a thick envelope on the table, but Leah barely glanced at the money. Just then, Leo ran into the room, his face lighting up when he saw her. "You came! I knew my dad would find you!" He ran to her and, without hesitation, hugged her. The spontaneous gesture broke the ice in Leah's heart. She mattered to someone. Richard watched the scene, a lump forming in his throat. "So," he said, clearing his throat to hide his emotion, "tell me exactly what you saw." Leah looked at the man's serious face and gathered all her courage. "The nanny," she said, her voice little more than a whisper. "She was there the whole time, hiding. She wasn't scared, she was angry. Angry that the men couldn't take Leo." Richard Sterling stood motionless, his face turning into a mask of disbelief and annoyance. The accusation hung in the silent air of the room, a dangerous spark thrown by a street kid against one of his most trusted employees. The silence that followed Leah's words was heavy and dense. Richard Sterling stared at her, his grey eyes scrutinizing her as if he could read her thoughts. Skepticism and irritation vied for space on his face. The idea was absurd, accusing Clara, the nanny who had passed a rigorous background check of something so monstrous. It sounded like the delusion of a child whose imagination had been overstimulated by trauma. "That's a very serious accusation, young lady," he said, his tone as cold as the marble beneath Leah's feet. "Clara has been with us for 2 months. She has impeccable references. Why would she do something like that?" Leah felt a chill. The powerful man before her didn't believe her. She shrank back, the brief feeling of importance dissolving like smoke. She was just a girl from the streets, after all. Who would believe her? But then she looked at Leo, who was holding her hand tightly, his blue eyes full of trust. That gave her strength. "I saw it," she insisted, her voice gaining firmness. Her eyes, they were cold. She didn't scream for help when the men showed up. She just watched. Richard wanted to dismiss the story, send her away with the envelope of money and forget the whole thing. But there was something in the intensity of the girl's gaze, a raw sincerity that stopped him. And there was Leo, nodding vigorously at her every word. He looked from Leah's dirty, determined face to his son's pale, serious one. A seed of doubt, small but persistent, began to sprout in his mind. He had spent his life trusting facts, numbers, and contracts. Intuition was a luxury he rarely afforded himself. But for the first time in a long while, he decided to listen to that nagging voice in his head. "I'll look into it," he said, more to himself than to the children. Discreetly. He promised nothing, offered no hope, but for Leah, it was enough. In the days that followed, a strange routine was established. At Leo's insistent request, as he refused to be separated from his new friend, Leah began spending her days at the mansion. She wasn't a guest, nor an employee. She was a silent presence, an observer. The household staff treated her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. To them, she was an enigma, little Leo's pet project. Leah spent her days playing with Leo in the vast, manicured gardens, but her eyes were always alert. She watched everyone and everything, absorbing the dynamics of this house that was a world unto itself. She saw how the staff interacted, the unspoken words, the exchanged glances. Her intuition, honed by years of survival on the streets, was on high alert. While Richard, in his office, made discreet calls, double-checking Clara's references more carefully, Leah conducted her own investigation. She noticed things no one else would. She noticed that the gardener, a quiet man named Jonas, always seemed to know where Leo would be playing, even when plans changed at the last minute. She noticed him exchange quick, almost imperceptible glances with Clara when he thought no one was looking. One afternoon, while playing hide-and-seek with Leo near the greenhouse, Leah hid behind some bushes. From her hiding spot, she heard Clara's voice. "Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything?" she said, her voice low and tense, coming from inside the greenhouse. A man's voice, which Leah recognized as Jonas the gardener's, replied, "He's too busy worrying about the kid. He can't see what's right under his nose." Leah held her breath, her heart pounding. They weren't in this alone. The scheme was bigger than she had imagined. She backed away slowly, as carefully as possible, so as not to make a sound. She had to tell Richard, but how? How could a girl who couldn't even read or write convince such a powerful man that a conspiracy was brewing inside his own home? She looked at the imposing walls of the mansion, which had once seemed a refuge, and suddenly they became a gilded cage, full of secrets and danger. The discovery in the greenhouse left Leah on edge. The mansion, with its silent corridors and vast rooms, suddenly felt claustrophobic, filled with whispers and secrets that only she could hear. She continued to play with Leo, laughing at his jokes and running across the lawns. But behind her smile, her mind was working non-stop. How could she prove what she'd heard? Her words alone were worthless. She needed something more, something Richard Sterling couldn't ignore. She began to watch Clara and Jonas with even sharper attention. She realized they never spoke openly, but communicated through subtle gestures. A nod of the head as they passed in the hallway, an object left in a specific spot in the garden as a signal. It was a secret language, and Leah was determined to decipher it. She noticed a pattern. Whenever Jonas trimmed the roses near the library, Clara would appear shortly after with a tea tray for Richard, lingering in the office longer than necessary. What was happening in there? Meanwhile, Richard's discreet investigation was yielding disturbing results. The agency that had provided Clara's references was, in fact, a shell company. The listed address was an abandoned building, and the phone numbers were all disconnected. The woman he trusted with his son's life was a complete fraud. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. He felt foolish, naive. How could he have been so blind? The accusation from the little street girl, which he had initially dismissed as fantasy, now echoed in his mind with terrifying weight. He looked out his office window and saw Leah and Leo building a pillow fort in the living room. The sound of his son's genuine laughter, something he hadn't heard in days, hit him hard. This girl, with nothing but the clothes on her back, was doing more for Leo than any expensive toy or therapy he could buy. And she had been right. He called her into his office. "Leah," he said, his tone serious and devoid of its earlier arrogance. "You were right about Clara's references. They're fake." Leah felt a wave of relief, but not triumph. There was no time for that. "It's not just her," she said quickly, seizing the opportunity. "The gardener, Jonas, he's with her. And there's someone else. A driver." Richard frowned. "The driver? What makes you think that?" "I saw them," Leah explained, describing an incident she had witnessed the night before. She had been in the kitchen getting a glass of water when she saw one of the household drivers, a new man named Ben, slip a small envelope to Jonas near the garage. They didn't say a word, but the exchange was quick and furtive, clearly something not meant to be seen. Richard listened intently, his jaw tight. He was living in a viper's nest. 3 of his employees, people who had unrestricted access to his home and his family, were conspiring against him. The anger gave way to an icy fear. The first plan had failed, but they wouldn't give up. They would try again, and he needed to know when and how. That night, while the mansion slept, Leah couldn't close her eyes. She was in a small guest room that Richard had insisted she occupy, but the soft bed felt strange and too big. She got up and went to the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens. The beauty of the place was a facade, hiding an invisible threat. She felt the weight of responsibility on her small shoulders. Leo's safety depended on her ability to see what others couldn't. It was then that she saw a faint light coming from the pool house. Curious, she slipped on the slippers they had given her and crept silently down the stairs, heading out into the garden. Hiding behind an angel statue, she saw Clara, speaking on the phone in a low, urgent voice. The wind carried fragments of her conversation. "The charity gala, the perfect opportunity with so many guests. No one will notice. This time, we can't fail." Leah's heart went cold. A second attempt, and it would be soon, during the grand annual party the Sterlings hosted for the city's high society. The danger hadn't passed. In fact, it was closer than ever. The revelation about the charity gala weighed on Leah like a stone. The grand celebration, which had once been just a whispered rumor among the staff, now took on a sinister shape. It would be the perfect stage for disaster, a whirlwind of unfamiliar faces and loud music where a child could disappear in the blink of an eye. She knew she had to tell Richard, but fear paralyzed her. The conspirators were getting bolder, and she could feel their eyes on her, sharp and suspicious. Clara no longer left her alone with Leo for long, always finding an excuse to interrupt their games. Jonas, the gardener, would stop working and watch her from a distance whenever she walked by. They knew that she knew. The mansion, which for a brief period had felt like a sanctuary, had now turned into a silent battlefield, and she was a lone soldier in enemy territory. Leah's biggest obstacle, however, was not fear, but the mistrust she inspired. She was an outsider, an anomaly in this world of luxury and privilege. The other staff members viewed her with resentment, whispering that she was taking advantage of their employer's kindness. To them, she was just a street kid, and her stories, however true, sounded like fabrications to gain attention and favors. Clara, sensing this hostility, began to use it to her advantage. She planted small seeds of doubt, making casual comments to other staff members. "It's a shame what life on the streets does to a child, isn't it? They learn to lie to survive," she would say with a false tone of compassion. The tactic was subtle but effective. Slowly, the atmosphere around Leah began to sour. The breaking point came on a sunny afternoon, 3 days before the gala. Richard's wife, an elegant but distant woman who spent most of her time traveling, was home. She was getting ready in her walk-in closet, a room the size of Leah's old shelter, when she let out a scream. A diamond necklace, a priceless family heirloom, had vanished from her jewelry box. Chaos erupted. All employees were gathered and questioned. The tension was palpable. Clara, her face pale and her eyes wide, suggested with feigned reluctance that perhaps they should check the new visitor's belongings. The suggestion hung in the air, laden with poison. Reluctantly, Richard agreed. It was standard procedure, he justified to himself. The search was quick and humiliating. Marcus, the head of security, went to Leah's small guest room. Inside, the only tattered backpack she owned, wrapped in a worn-out t-shirt, was the necklace. The sparkle of the diamonds under the room's light seemed to mock her. Leah gasped for air. It was a trap, so obvious and so cruel. "I didn't take it, I swear," she said, her voice trembling, looking at Richard, pleading with her eyes for him to believe her. But the evidence was irrefutable. The jewel was in her things. She saw the doubt on Richard's face, a terrible battle being waged between his intuition and the cold logic of the facts. His wife had no such doubts. "I knew it. I told you it was a bad idea to bring someone like that into our home," she exclaimed, her contempt obvious. Torn, Richard made the only decision that seemed possible. He didn't call the police. Something inside him still refused to believe Leah was guilty, but his family's safety came first. "Leah, I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and tired. "I think it's best if you go, at least for now, until we clear this up." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. He was kicking her out. She looked at Leo, who was watching everything with tear-filled eyes, not understanding what was happening. "She didn't do it," he cried, but no one listened. Escorted by the security guard, Leah was led to the iron gates. As they closed behind her with a metallic, final click, she found herself back where she started, alone, on the street, with the weight of a false accusation and the certainty that Leo was still in terrible danger. The difference was, now she had no way to warn him. The pavement had never felt so hard and cold beneath Leah's feet. The afternoon sun, which had once warmed her face, now seemed to mock her, illuminating her defeat. Every step away from that mansion was a step back into the world she knew so well. A world of invisibility and indifference. The humiliation burned in her chest, a hot ember of injustice. They had called her a thief. They had discarded her as if she were a piece of trash. The pain of betrayal was sharper than any hunger she had ever felt. Richard hadn't believed her. After everything, he had chosen the comfortable lie over the inconvenient truth. Hot, stubborn tears welled in her eyes, but she wiped them away angrily. Crying wouldn't solve anything. Despair threatened to swallow her. A dark abyss opening at her feet. It would be so easy to give up, to accept that this was just how the world worked, that people like her never stood a chance. But then, the image of Leo's face, small and scared, flashed in her mind. He believed her, and he was still in there, surrounded by wolves in sheep's clothing. The certainty that her friend was in imminent danger rekindled the flame of determination in her heart. Anger turned into fuel, pain into purpose. They had kicked her out, but they hadn't defeated her. They had underestimated her. They thought because she was small and poor, she was weak. They were wrong. She was no longer fighting just for a plate of food or a safe place to sleep. She was fighting for Leo and for her own honor. Alone and discredited, Leah knew she couldn't rely on anyone else. She had to act on her own. Her mind, sharpened by the need to anticipate dangers on the street, began to work, to devise a plan. She couldn't get in through the front gates, but she knew the property now. She knew its flaws, its blind spots. She remembered a section of the back wall, covered in thick ivy, where 1 or 2 stones were loose. As night fell, Leah returned. She moved through the shadows like a ghost, her heart hammering against her ribs, a mix of fear and adrenaline coursing through her veins. She found the spot in the wall and, with tremendous effort, managed to pry the loose stones away, creating an opening just large enough for her slender body to slip through. She was back in enemy territory. The garden, once a paradise, was now a dangerous labyrinth, full of dancing shadows and noises that made her jump. She crept toward the main house, staying close to the bushes, her body tense with every snap of a twig. Her goal was to get as close as possible to the windows of the kitchen or the staff quarters, places where she might overhear something, anything she could use. She hid behind a large row of rose bushes near the service patio. The kitchen lights were on, and she could hear the staff's voices inside. It was then that she heard them. Clara and Jonas were standing just outside, smoking in the dim light, thinking they were safe. Their voices were low, but in the quiet of the night, every word reached Leah like a shout. "The plan worked perfectly," Clara was saying, a note of cruel satisfaction in her voice. "The great Richard Sterling fell for it completely. The brat is out of the way." Jonas let out a low, rough laugh. "It was brilliant, using that fake necklace. Now we have a clear path for the gala." What Leah heard next made her blood run cold. "But the boss is getting impatient," Jonas continued. "He said the kidnapping isn't enough anymore. After we grab the kid, we'll use the documents the accountant prepared. We're going to make it look like Sterling embezzled millions from his own charity. He won't just lose his son. He'll lose everything. His reputation, his company, his freedom." The revelation hit her with the force of a wave. It wasn't just about ransom money. It was about total destruction. And the accountant, Richard's trusted man, was in on it too. The plan was much bigger, more diabolical than she had ever imagined. They didn't just want Richard's money, they wanted his life. And she was the only one who knew the whole truth. The conspirators' words echoed in Leah's mind, a cold poison spreading through her veins, total destruction. The phrase haunted her as she backed away from the rose bushes, her heart beating wildly. The plan was a complex, cruel web, and Leo was just the bait. The real target was Richard. They wanted to ruin him, to erase his name and his fortune, and kidnapping his son was just the first, most vicious move. The sheer scale of the evil made her dizzy. How could people be so wicked? The injustice of her own expulsion seemed trivial compared to the catastrophe about to befall this family. She had to warn Richard. But how? Who would believe her now, an accused thief who had trespassed on the property? She was trapped in a nightmare, holding a terrible truth that no one would hear. For the 2 days leading up to the gala, Leah lived in the shadows of the mansion. By day, she hid in an old, abandoned boathouse by the lake at the back of the property. At night, she took risks, creeping closer to the house to watch and listen. Hunger was a constant ache, but fear and urgency kept her alert. She survived on fruit she picked from the orchard trees and water from a garden hose. Loneliness was her constant companion, and the weight of the secret was crushing her. In her waking hours, she would see Leo playing in the garden, always under Clara's watchful eye. The boy seemed quieter, the natural joy in his eyes replaced by a shadow of sadness. He missed her, Leah knew, and seeing him so close, yet unreachable, was torture. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Richard was immersed in his own private hell. The decision to send Leah away gnawed at him. Every time he looked into Leo's sad eyes or heard his son ask when his friend was coming back, he felt a pang of guilt. Logic told him he had done the right thing. The evidence was clear, but his gut screamed that he had made a terrible mistake. He tried to convince himself it was for the best, that Leah's presence brought instability. But the truth was, since she had left, the house felt colder, quieter. The suspicion he felt towards Clara hadn't faded. On the contrary, it had grown. He began to watch his employee more closely, noticing the triumphant glint in her eyes, the over-the-top confidence in her gestures. He tried to focus on preparations for the charity gala, one of the most important events of the year for his company. But his mind was elsewhere, stuck on the image of Leah's honest, accusing eyes. Leah knew time was running out. She had to find an ally, someone on the inside who might listen. Her mind ran through every face she had seen in the house. Most despised her, but there were a few who had always treated her with a quiet kindness. There was Mrs. Helen, the head cook, a woman with grey hair and gentle eyes who would sometimes slip her an extra cookie. And there was Mr. Alfred, the butler, an elderly man who had served the Sterling family for over 30 years and who looked at Leo with a grandfather's affection. They were the old guard, loyal to Richard in a way the newer employees were not. It was a risk, but it was her only chance. The night before the gala, Leah saw Mrs. Helen leaving late, walking toward the service gate. With her heart in her throat, Leah slipped out of her hiding place and intercepted her. The cook let out a small gasp of surprise at seeing her emerge from the darkness, thin and dirty. "Child, what are you doing here? It's dangerous." "I didn't steal the necklace," Leah said, her voice urgent and low. "Clara framed me, her and Jonas, the gardener and the accountant. They're going to take Leo during the party tomorrow, and they're going to blame Mr. Richard for stealing money." The torrent of words left her breathless. Helen stared at her, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. It was a fantastic story, hard to believe. But looking at the desperation and sincerity in the girl's face, the cook felt a shiver. She remembered small, odd details she'd noticed. Conversations that stopped when she entered the kitchen, the way Clara and Jonas always seemed aware of each other's movements. The older woman's intuition, honed by decades of observation, began to connect the dots. "My God," she whispered, her hand covering her mouth. Alfred noticed it too. He said the accountant has been asking a lot of strange questions lately. Suddenly, Leah was no longer alone. She had an ally. The alliance with Mrs. Helen was like a ray of sunshine in the storm. For the first time in days, Leah didn't feel completely alone in her fight. The cook hid her in a small pantry at the back of the kitchen, a warm place that smelled of spices and bread. She gave her a bowl of hearty stew that felt like the most delicious meal Leah had ever tasted, and a glass of milk that soothed the knot in her stomach. While Leah ate, Helen went to find Mr. Alfred. The old butler entered the pantry minutes later, his wrinkled face etched with deep concern. He listened to Leah's story without interrupting, his intelligent eyes weighing every word. When she finished, he and Helen exchanged a look. The same silent understanding passed between them. They had served this family too long not to recognize the scent of danger. "I believe you, child," Alfred said, his voice deep and steady. "I never trusted that Clara. Eyes too close together, always watching. And the accountant, Mr. Morris, he's been very evasive lately, locking drawers, taking papers home. It's not like him." Leah's relief was so immense, she almost cried. They believed her. Together, the three of them formed an unlikely war council in the small room. A street girl, a cook, and a butler. They knew that going directly to Richard with this fantastic story, especially after the necklace incident, was risky. He might not believe them, or worse, inadvertently alert the conspirators. They needed concrete proof, something Richard couldn't deny. "The necklace," Leah said suddenly, the memory of the setup sparking an idea. "Jonas said it was a fake necklace. That means the real one must still be somewhere. Or maybe the stolen jewel never really existed." The theory was bold. What if Richard's wife had never owned that specific necklace? What if the piece planted in Leah's things was the only one that existed, created solely to frame her? It was a possibility, but proving it was another matter. Their focus shifted to the following night, the gala. It would be the conspirators' moment to act, but also their best opportunity to unmask them. They needed to find out exactly how the plan would unfold. Alfred, with his discreet presence and access to all areas of the house, would be their eyes and ears. Helen, from the kitchen, would monitor conversations among the staff hired for the event. Leah, with her ability to be invisible, would try to stay as close to Clara as possible. Night fell, and the mansion transformed. Twinkling lights were strung in the trees, tables were draped in white linen, and the sound of an orchestra tuning its instruments floated on the air. Elegant guests began to arrive, a river of silk, jewels, and expensive perfume. To Leah, hidden away, watching it all from an upstairs window, the scene was surreal. So much wealth and beauty, and beneath it all, a dark undercurrent of betrayal. Their plan hit an unexpected snag. Clara, always a step ahead, decided that Leo was too tired for the party and would put him to bed early. This meant he would be alone and vulnerable in his room, out of sight. Leah's worry intensified. Had the plan changed? She had to see for herself. Using the service corridors Alfred had shown her, she made her way to the second floor. The party music muffled her footsteps. She approached Leo's room and heard Clara's voice inside, singing a lullaby. But something was wrong. The door wasn't fully closed. Peeking through the crack, Leah saw something that made her hold her breath. Clara was standing near the window, speaking quietly on the phone. Leo was nowhere in sight. And worse, the bedroom window, which opened onto a low roof over the veranda, was ajar. "Everything's ready," Clara whispered into the phone. "They're already waiting down below. No one will think to look on the roof. We'll be gone before anyone even notices he's missing from his bed." The plan wasn't to snatch him during the party. It was to take him from his own room, making it look like he had wandered off or run away. And it was happening right now. Panic threatened to choke Leah. The plan had been changed, moved up. There was no time to get help, no time to find Alfred or Helen. Every second counted. Hidden in the dark hallway, she saw Clara end the call, cast one last look at the open window, and leave the room, locking the door from the outside. The click of the lock sounded like a sentence. They had isolated the target. Leah waited, heart hammering against her ribs, until Clara's footsteps faded down the hall. She ran to the door and tried the knob. Locked. Desperate, she looked around. She had to get into that room. Her survivor's mind worked fast. She remembered seeing, in one of the cleaning closets, a set of master keys that Alfred kept for emergencies. It was a 1-in-a-million chance, but she had to try. Dashing back down the service corridor, she found the closet. Her small, trembling hands fumbled with the hooks, trying key after key in Leo's door. The fourth key turned. With a sigh of relief, she silently opened the door and slipped inside. The room was empty. Leo's bed was neatly made, his favorite teddy bear lying on the pillow, a cruel decoy for anyone who glanced in. A cold night wind blew in through the open window, making the curtains billow like ghosts. Leah ran to the window and looked down. The veranda roof stretched for a few feet before ending above the dark back gardens. Down below, in the shadow of a large magnolia tree, she saw two figures, Jonas and the driver, Ben. They were looking up, waiting. And on the roof, crouched near the edge, was Leo. He didn't look scared. He looked confused. Clara had probably tricked him with the promise of a nighttime adventure. Leah didn't scream. She knew that would only make them act faster. She had to be smart. She looked around the room for something, anything she could use. Her eyes landed on the heavy brass lamp beside Leo's bed. It was too heavy for her to carry, but the cord was long. With a tremendous effort, she dragged the lamp's base to the window and, with all her strength, shoved it out. The heavy object crashed onto the roof with a deafening bang, shattering the tiles. The noise was like a gunshot in the quiet night. Jonas and Ben froze, startled. Leo let out a cry of surprise. The loud crash was enough to draw attention. Lights flickered on in other windows. Down in the garden, a few guests who were outside turned toward the sound. Their plan was ruined. The element of surprise was gone. Jonas hissed an order to Ben, and the two of them turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness before anyone could identify them. In the room, Leah leaned out the window. "Leo, get back inside. Now," she whispered urgently. Leo, seeing his friend's familiar face, obeyed without hesitation. Scrambling back across the roof and jumping into the room, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Leah, what's happening? Clara said we were going to see the stars." "She lied," Leah said, hugging him tightly. Hurried footsteps sounded in the hallway. The door flew open and Richard Sterling burst in, his face pale with dread. Marcus, the head of security, was right behind him. "What was that noise?" "Leo! What are you doing out of bed?" He stopped short when he saw Leah there, next to the open window and the shattered lamp. The confusion on his face was total. He looked from the street girl to his son, and then to the wide-open window. "Leah, how did you get in here?" But before she could answer, Alfred's voice sounded behind them, calm and full of authority. "Sir, I think there's something you need to know, and this time, you need to listen." Standing beside the butler was Helen, her face serious and resolute. The truth was about to come out, in the middle of the chaos she had created. The presence of Alfred and Helen instantly changed the dynamic in the room. Richard looked from his oldest, most loyal employees to the dirty, panting girl holding his son's hand. The confusion in his mind gave way to a terrible suspicion that he had judged everything catastrophically wrong. "Alfred, what is going on?" he demanded, his voice tense. "The girl is not a thief, sir," Alfred said with a calmness that belied the chaos of the moment. "She was framed. Clara, Jonas, the driver, Ben, and, I'm afraid to say, Mr. Morris, your accountant, are all involved. They plan to take young Leo tonight and then use forged documents to accuse you of fraud." Each of the butler's words was like a hammer blow, shattering the structure of trust Richard had built over years. The accountant, Morris, a man who had worked with him for over a decade, who knew every detail of his financial and personal life. The betrayal was so profound it left him breathless. As Alfred spoke, Helen added details, describing the suspicious conversation she'd overheard, the exchanged glances, the secretive atmosphere surrounding the conspirators. And then Leah told her part, her voice low but clear, describing what she'd heard in the garden, the plan to use the roof, Clara's phone call, the complete story, told from 3 different voices, painted an undeniable and terrifying picture. Richard listened, his face hardening with each revelation. The anger he felt was cold and sharp, anger at his employees, but most of all, anger at himself, at his blindness, his arrogance. He had kicked out the one person who had tried to warn him, the only one brave enough to tell the truth. He looked at Leah, and for the first time, he truly saw her, not as a street kid, but as a protector, an unlikely hero who had risked everything for his son. An overwhelming sense of shame and gratitude washed over him. "Marcus," Richard said, his voice cutting like steel as he turned to his head of security, "find Clara and Morris. Now, they are not to leave this property." Marcus nodded and hurried out. Speaking into his radio, Richard knelt in front of Leah. "Leah, I, he began, but the words failed him. I am so sorry. I should have believed you. It's okay, Leah whispered. The important thing is that Leo is safe. The simplicity of her reply, her complete lack of resentment, disarmed Richard entirely. In that moment, he understood that this girl's strength came not from anger or a need for revenge, but from a pure, unshakable loyalty and sense of justice. The party downstairs continued, the music and laughter floating up to them, a surreal backdrop to the unfolding drama. But Richard Sterling's world had shrunk to this one room. The capture of the conspirators was swift and quiet. Clara was found in her room with a packed suitcase by the door, her face twisting in rage and shock when security intercepted her. Morris, the accountant, was caught in his car trying to slip out the service gates, a briefcase full of incriminating documents beside him. Jonas and Ben were located later that night, hiding out in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. The web of lies had unraveled, but as justice began to take its course, one question lingered. The jewel, the necklace that had been the catalyst for everything. Alfred, with his impeccable memory, recalled a crucial detail. Sir, Mrs. Sterling has never owned a diamond necklace like that one. Her family heirloom is an emerald brooch. I polished it myself last week. The final confirmation, the necklace never existed. It was a fake, a tangible lie created for the sole purpose of destroying Leah's credibility. The revelation was the last piece of the puzzle, exposing the calculated cruelty of the plan and the absolute innocence of the girl who had unraveled it. The charity gala, which had started as a glittering affair, ended under a cloud of whispers and confused glances as discreet police cruisers arrived at the mansion. Richard Sterling, with iron composure, managed to keep most of the drama from his guests, ending the event early with a polite excuse about a family emergency. But for those who remained, the security team, the loyal staff, and the small, unlikely heroine, the night was far from over. The mansion, now silent, felt vast and empty, the festive decorations mocking the tension that filled the air. Seated in the library, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling books that smelled of leather and old paper, Richard, Leah, and Leo waited. Alfred served hot chocolate to the children, his movements calm and steady, a point of stability in the whirlwind. Richard watched Leah, who was sitting in a velvet armchair far too big for her, clutching the warm mug with both hands. She looked exhausted, the night's adrenaline giving way to a deep weariness. But in her eyes, there was a stillness, a strength that amazed him. This child, whom the world had cast aside, possessed more integrity and courage than most adults he knew. She had not only saved his son and his fortune, she had saved him from himself, from his own suspicion and prejudice. He was indebted to her in a way no amount of money could ever repay. The tensest moment was not the capture of the criminals, but what came after. The quiet, meaningful conversation between a powerful man who realized his fallibility and a girl who had never doubted her own worth, even when everyone else had. A detective, a man with a tired face and a sharp gaze, entered the library. He addressed Richard, but his eyes kept drifting back to Leah. Mr. Sterling, the accountant, Morris, confessed to everything, he said. It seems he's been embezzling from your company for years. The shortfall was massive. He was desperate. The kidnapping was his way to get a large sum of cash quickly and cover his tracks. The detective paused, glancing at some papers in his hand. He also confirmed that the plan to frame you was devised in case the kidnapping failed. He wanted to seize control of the company in the ensuing chaos. The confession was the final piece, the irrefutable proof of everything Leah had uncovered. Justice would be served. The guilty would pay for their actions. But for Richard, the legal resolution was secondary. The real resolution he sought was emotional. He turned to Leah, his heart heavy with remorse and gratitude. "Leah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, There are no words to thank you for what you did. You gave me my son back. You saved my family. You saved me. He knelt in front of her, a gesture of humility that shocked Alfred, who was watching from the doorway. I misjudged you. I cast you out of my home and my heart, and yet you came back to protect us. Can you forgive me? Leah looked at the powerful man's face, now vulnerable and sincere. She didn't see a millionaire, but a father who loved his son. In her eyes, there was no accusation, only an understanding that was far beyond her years. There's nothing to forgive, she said softly. Leo is my friend. At that moment, Leo, who had been nearly asleep on the sofa, came over and hugged them both, forming a small circle of affection in the middle of the grand library. I want Leah to stay, Daddy, he said, his voice sleepy. Forever. She's our family now. The child's words, spoken with the purest innocence, hung in the air, weighted with an undeniable truth. It was not a request, but a declaration. The cold, empty mansion finally had a chance to become a home. And the decision Richard would make next would not only change Leah's life forever, but would also redefine the meaning of family for them all. Leo's words, "She's our family now," echoed in the silent library, filling the space with a simple, powerful truth. For Richard, it was as if a long-stuck lock in his heart had finally sprung open. He looked at Leah, at her large, serious eyes that had seen more than any child should, and knew his son was right. Family wasn't just about blood, it was about connection, loyalty, and the kind of protective love this small girl had shown without hesitation. He stood up, his decision made, clear and irrevocable. Leo's right, he said, his voice firm but full of an emotion he rarely showed. This is your home now, Leah, if you'll have it. It wasn't an offer of a reward, nor an act of charity. It was an invitation, a plea for her to stay and be part of their lives, not as a guest, but as an essential member of the family she herself had helped save. Leah stared at him, trying to process the meaning of his words. A home, a family. They were concepts so alien to her reality, they seemed to belong in a fairy tale. Her entire life, she had been invisible, a ghost on the streets of a city that ignored her. Now she was being seen, valued, loved. Tears, this time not of pain or anger, but of overwhelming relief, filled her eyes. She couldn't speak, only nod, a small movement that sealed her fate. Leo, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, grinned and hugged Leah tightly. In that embrace, all the fear, all the loneliness, and all the injustice Leah had endured began to dissipate, replaced by a warmth and a sense of belonging she had never known was possible. In the days that followed, life in the Sterling mansion began to transform. The departure of Richard's wife, who decided the drama of the situation was too much for her and embarked on an extended trip to Europe, left a vacuum that was quickly filled by a new dynamic. Richard, freed from a cold marriage and misplaced trust in his staff, began to rediscover his role as a father. He cut back his hours at the office, spending afternoons building Lego fortresses with Leo and Leah, or listening to the stories Leah made up about magical creatures that lived in the garden. He learned to laugh again, a genuine laugh that echoed through the previously silent halls. The mansion, once a showroom of wealth, began to gain the soul of a real home, with children's drawings stuck to the refrigerator and the sound of laughter filling the air. Leah, in turn, blossomed. With the help of a private tutor Richard hired, she learned to read and write with astonishing speed, devouring the books in the library as if starved for knowledge. The fierceness she once used to survive, she now channeled into learning about the world. But her greatest joy was the simplicity of having a routine, waking up in the same bed every morning, having guaranteed meals, and most importantly, having people who cared if she was safe and happy. The constant sense of abandonment that had haunted her for so long began to recede. replaced by the certainty that she had found her place in the world. Her internal conflicts about her own self-worth dissolved in the unconditional acceptance she found with Richard and Leo. She learned that a person's value wasn't in their origins or possessions, but in the strength of their character and the capacity of their heart. Justice prevailed not only in the courts, where the conspirators received their sentences, but also within the walls of that house, where a broken family was rebuilt on a foundation of courage, loyalty, and love. Leah's arc of suffering was complete, giving way to a journey of healing and overcoming, proving that even in the darkest shadows, the light of one brave act can change everything. 3 weeks after the day that changed their lives, the morning sun streamed through the breakfast room window, painting golden stripes across the wooden table. The smell of pancakes made by Mrs. Helen hung in the air. Leo was excitedly explaining the rules of a game he had invented, while Leah listened intently, her hair now clean and styled in 2 braids, a small smile playing on her lips. Richard watched the scene from across the table, a cup of coffee in his hands, his heart overflowing with a peace he hadn't felt in years. The transformation was remarkable. The house breathed with life. The cold formality had given way to a comfortable, messy warmth. There were more laughs, more hugs, and a palpable sense of happiness. Leah was no longer the wary, silent girl who had first arrived. The safety of a home and the love of a family had allowed her to just be a child. Her sharp intuition was still there, but now she used it to sense when Leah was sad or when Richard needed a hug. Her unconditional loyalty, once a survival tool, had become the bedrock of their new family. She had found not just a roof over her head, but a purpose. She belonged here, and they belonged to her. That morning, Richard had one last surprise. After breakfast, he led them to the library. On the large mahogany desk was a neat stack of official-looking papers. "Leah," he said, his voice gentle, "I've spoken with some people, lawyers and judges. These are adoption papers. I would like, if you'll accept, to officially become your father." Leah's eyes widened. She looked from the papers to Richard's face, searching for any sign this wasn't real. But all she saw was sincerity and a profound affection. Father. The word was foreign on her tongue, a sound she never thought she would say. She didn't need to answer. Her tight hug around Richard's neck was all the answer he needed. Leo joined the embrace, and the 3 of them stood there, a knot of affection, the family that fate had so unexpectedly brought together. The journey had been filled with pain, fear, and injustice, but it had led them to this moment of pure joy and wholeness. The lessons were profound for everyone. Richard learned that true wealth wasn't in his bank vaults, but in human connection, and that trust and intuition were as valuable as any balance sheet. Leah learned that she was not defined by her past and that she was worthy of love and security. The story of the brave street girl who saved a millionaire's son became a kind of local legend, an inspiring reminder that heroes can emerge from the most unexpected places. The Sterling mansion was no longer just a symbol of wealth, but a symbol of hope, a place where kindness had triumphed over greed. Looking out the window at the sunny garden, Leah saw her reflection in the glass. It was no longer the face of a lost, hungry girl, but that of a daughter, a sister, a survivor. She had finally found her home, not in a house of marble and luxury, but in the hearts of the people who loved her. The narrative that had begun with a desperate scream in a dark alley now ended in a happy silence, with the promise of a bright future, proving that a person's greatest value lies not in what they have, but in what they are able to give. And Leah, the girl who had nothing, had given them all the most valuable gift of all, a second chance.